While he's pulling up my PowerPoint, just want to say that usually in October I am hands and nose to the ground harvesting stuff and working very hard. I usually do not leave the farm in October. And the only person I see is my husband and my brother-in-law and sister-in-law, and except for Sundays when we go into church. So I really appreciate this break from that grind, because it can get to be a real grind. And my hands, thank you. Carpal tunnel issues. So let's see, okay. This is a bulletin that was written by one of our first plant breeders, and at that time it was the North Dakota Agricultural College, and this is A.F. Yeager. He was a breeder at the Agricultural College, and he said, "This bulletin is written to present to the people of North Dakota a picture of the steps necessary in the development of a new variety, so that they may perhaps be stimulated to undertake practical plant breeding themselves." So at that point in time, plant breeding was not relegated to the experts, that only the experts did plant breeding. But here is an actual expert encouraging the citizens of North Dakota to undertake this work. So one of the organizations that I'm a member of is the Northern Plains Sustainable Agriculture Society and their Farm Breeding Club. And their Farm Breeding Club brings farmers together to share knowledge and seed stock for seed saving and crop breeding and fellowship. So this is a group that is actively encouraging each other to take on this work. And they were inspired by this book, Return to Resistance, by Raoul Robinson. And in here he talks about the need for diversity in our cropping systems, but not only a diversity of crops that we're cropping, but also the genetic diversity within the crops. And one of the things that we've been doing with our crop breeding programs is breeding for uniformity, because we're breeding for those monocrop agricultural systems, and you want to be able to have nice uniform fields, the nice clean looking fields. You want nice uniform fields with the same crop, basically taking away the genetic diversity within that crop. And so as you breed for uniformity, you also inadvertently breed in a self-destruct mechanism, because with the genetic uniformity, you have pest crop diseases that will attack that crop and eventually will learn how to get around that crop's defense systems. And so eventually you have what farmers refer to as a crop variety running out, meaning that it's no longer performing like it did when you first introduced that crop into your cropping system. That's because the disease and plant or pest cycles are working to break down that defense mechanism or the whatever resistance that particular variety has. And so what our farmers are looking for is what they call enduring varieties. So these varieties have the genetic diversity within them to be able to evolve with plant pest and disease cycles, and to still find within themselves the ability to resist those pests and disease. So the FBC was able to find research partners within the university community to conduct organic variety trials. And so this is trials of oats here. And not only did we want the university to engage farmers and do these trials for us, but we wanted them to do it with us. So now you have researchers and farmers doing participatory variety evaluation. And the value of that is that researchers are looking through their research eyes, but farmers are looking through their farmer eyes and from their farmer perspective, and bringing the knowledge of how a variety will or won't perform within their farming system back to the researcher. So you've got that dynamic between the researcher and the farmer, and that you'll have a much more effective variety evaluation process that way, bringing in both perspectives. So this is an initial variety screening of Emmer and Einkorn. And these are two ancient grains that the Farm Breeding Club decided to start taking a look at, mainly because they predate, they have not had the breeding for uniformity done to them. So we were looking at Emmer and Einkorn varieties that had been grown on the northern Great Plains. So we actually trialed Emmer, Einkorn, and Spelt. And so this is another picture of those trials. And part of what we were doing was looking at the history of what was grown on the northern Great Plains when farmers first came here. And they brought with them their Emmer, Einkorn, and Spelt. And this is a picture of the distribution of Emmer from 1919. And so you can see the estimated acreage. Well, Emmer has fallen into disuse for the most part. Some of the interest in Emmer, Einkorn, and Spelt is coming from the gluten-free market, the issues of gluten intolerance. And Emmer, Einkorn, and Spelt are not gluten-free, but the gluten is different. The chemical makeup of the gluten is different. And so some people can tolerate this. So there is a market for these ancient grains out there. So not only is there interest from farmers in further diversifying production systems and finding higher value crops, but there's also interest from the consumer community, not only in the idea of going back to ancient grains, but also the gluten-free market. There's another type of plant breeding called evolutionary plant breeding. And basically what that is to put together a composite of as many different varieties that you find have traits that you may be interested in, and create what used to be called land races. Now they call it a composite. And put that out on the land and replant it in the same place, in that same production system over many years, and allow whatever disease, pest cycles, or environmental challenges are present within the farming system to act on that population. And by doing that, basically using the principles of survival of the fittest, that you will basically force those plants. Oats is primarily self-pollinating, but there's a certain amount of outcrossing. And the plants that do really well are going to be the ones that survive. But the other thing, the plants that are stressed, their outcrossing rate goes up. So you have this mixing of genetic diversity within that composite of all these different, more or less uniform varieties, and creating that diversity within the crop to allow for the plant to evolve with whatever challenges are present. And we think this is particularly important as we face the issues of climate change, that not only do we need diversity of crops on the landscape, and any of you who have any knowledge of farming know that risk management is one of the key tools that we need. Well, if you have monocrop systems with genetically uniform crops, consider the risk management or the risk that you're exposed to in that system versus a system of agriculture that has not only a diversity of crops, but genetic diversity within those crops to evolve with whatever is going to be thrown at them. So another thing that we're working on is white sorghum. And again, this is to further diversify the cropping systems, to look for another potential crop that might fill the niche in the rotation that corn currently fits. Part of the philosophy is that corn is overproduced. You just look around. Corn, soybeans are in large part what you see on the landscape. And so, but corn fits a particular niche in a crop rotation. So we're looking for a crop that could fit that same niche. And this isn't a new idea. John Gardner was working on trying to find a cold hardy white sorghum back in his early days at the Carrington Research Extension Center. He did some of the groundbreaking work on this. And there was a retiring plant breeder who was originally from North Dakota but was working out on the West Coast. And he was working with white sorghum. He said, I think I have a number of lines that you may be interested in trialing to see whether or not it could perform in North Dakota. And so we have 100 lines of cold-tolerant white sorghum. And sorghum is traditionally a southern crop. So we're looking to bring it into a northern crop rotation. And we're currently trialing those and also working with markets that are selling white sorghum. White sorghum, again, is another crop that the gluten-free market is very interested in seeing. So we're not only trialing them to assess their agronomic performance, but also looking to see whether or not it meets the quality market characteristics that they're looking for. Another thing we're working on is our cover crop project. And Jay alluded to all the work that's being done with cover crops. One of the issues that our farmers were experiencing in adopting cover crops is that if they bought cowpeas, for instance, oftentimes they were only able to find cowpeas that were labeled VNS, which means variety not stated. So you don't know what variety of you're getting a cowpea, but you don't know what variety it is. And you may buy it from the same source from one year to the next and find that it performs differently because it's not the same variety you got the previous year. So it's very difficult to design cover crop systems and predict how they're going to act within your farming system when you don't even know what the variety is and what the characteristics of that variety might be. And so not only did we want to find cowpeas that would perform in our cover crop systems and provide us both the ability to use it as a cover crop but also to graze it, but we wanted to find varieties that we could actually take to seed here. One of the issues with cowpeas is that most of the cowpeas come from like the Georgia, from the southern belt. And again, it's a southern crop, so finding varieties that are adapted to North Dakota is a challenge. But when you buy your cover crop in from an area that has heavy cowpea production, for instance, you're also bringing in viruses. Even from the GRIN system, which is the USDA seed collection, if you order in cowpea seed, you'll have a slip in there that will warn you that it may contain viruses, that you're importing viruses that will attack your crop. So you can see where, from a phytosanitary standpoint, from preventing importing crop diseases, it makes more sense to produce your own seed than to import seed from an area that grows a lot of cowpeas, for instance, that also has virus issues, also has plant disease issues. So, and also you're simply paying for the shipping of that seed, making it much more expensive. So if we can grow it here and find varieties that perform well within our cropping systems, but also grow our own seed and supply our own seed, it's just a win-win for agriculture here in the Northern Plains. So you can see the diversity of cowpeas. I mean, to just buy cowpeas or black-eyed peas variety not stated you don't know what you're going to get. So we're also doing some variety trials on buckwheat. Buckwheat is a crop that you'll often see in organic farming systems, but again, there's been very little work done on buckwheat within the plant breeding community, and farmers were having issues with the varieties that were available to them. So we're bringing in plant germplasm from around the world, looking at what performs here, and looking at working with plant breeders to try and begin selecting parents to do some actual breeding in buckwheat. We're also working with a specialty crop grant through the North Dakota Department of Agriculture to do variety trials on vegetables. So our farm hosted organic green bean variety trials and also hosted carrot variety trials as part of this project. And basically what a variety trial is you choose 10 varieties that you may be interested in seeing how well they perform, and choose one what you would call a market standard, say the carrot that most people in this region would grow. And we're particularly interested in finding varieties that perform well for farmers, market growers. And so we basically surveyed them and found out what varieties they were currently using. So we would use that as the market standard. This is what you're currently growing, and compare 10 different varieties. And a lot of this research you would expect to be done at a land-grant university, and we actually had a vegetable breeding program at NDSU up till 1990. And so we're now looking at a 24-year gap in plant breeding for vegetable production here in North Dakota. So that's changing with the introduction of these variety trials and the new level of interest in how varieties perform for farmers, market growers, and for people looking to develop local food systems. There is renewed interest at NDSU in reviving their vegetable plant breeding program. So what we're doing with the Farm Breeding Club isn't unique. There's actually participatory plant breeding projects all across the U.S. and Canada. I've starred most of the projects that we know about here, and almost all of them involve land-grant universities, and the ones that don't involve nonprofit organizations that are working with farmers. So participatory plant breeding is that collaboration between plant breeders, farmers, and end users. And the collaborations are based on the knowledge and experience and the perspective of those particular entities. And the farmer and the researcher working side by side and talking about what they see is just a really valuable perspective. And you can see we even have millers and bakers getting involved with some of the projects that we're working on. This is Organic Seed Alliance. They're a nonprofit organization based out of Washington State, and they've been working with organic farmers and actually breeding vegetable varieties for organic farming systems. And I'm just going to go through a few of their releases as of late. Abundant Bloomsdale spinach. They've been working on carrots with the Northern Organic Vegetable Improvement Collaborative, which involved the closest partner in that is Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin-Madison. Purple sprouting broccoli, isn't that beautiful? Looks like lilacs on a spring day. Who Gets Kissed sweet corn? This was, again, University of Wisconsin corn breeder, Bill Tracy, working with a market grower around the Minneapolis area, Gardens of Egan, Martin Diffley, and they worked together to breed a sweet corn. So the 5 steps are to set your breeding objectives, then obtain useful genetics, make the crosses that you need to make, select the offspring that are promising, and then evaluate those selections. So the focus of this is, again, encouraging biodiversity. I don't know where it went forward. So breeding on farm encourages biodiversity by not only having a diversity of crops, but also a diversity of varieties and a diversity of genetics within those crops. So this is my brother-in-law, David, and he is the principal plant breeder on our farm. He's a farmer, but he has bred Sweet Dakota Rose watermelon, Sweet Dakota Bliss beets, Dakota Tears onion, Uncle David's Dakota dessert squash, Dakota Black Pop popcorn, Dakota Sisters melon, and Dakota Sport tomato. And so he took to heart what A.F. Yeager was encouraging farmers to do. So this is Sweet Dakota Rose watermelon. He crossed Black Diamond with Little Canada watermelon and began doing his selection work. And we had a near catastrophe happen where there was a disease that went through the patch and utterly destroyed everything except for 2 plants. And those 2 plants had resistance to this particular disease. Well, that turned out to be very valuable. We have not lost a crop since. We saved the seed from those plants. We kept planting them back. And we say that we do selection work on the sweetness of Sweet Dakota Rose, but I have to honestly tell you that I've never had a bad melon. So I don't know really what our role is in the selection work for Sweet Dakota Rose because we just love it. So we had our 2 nephews and a niece came during melon season. Were visiting the farm and helping us with dry bean harvest at the time, and they got to enjoy Sweet Dakota Rose watermelon and Dakota Sisters melon. And they were saying, "You mean you get to eat all the watermelon you want so you can save the seed from this?" And wow, I really like this job. So Dakota Tears onion. David was dissatisfied with the storability of the onion varieties that he had available to him. And so he began this, the project of breeding an onion that not only tasted good, but also would store through the winter, which was his primary focus. And so on our farm, we have onions year-round. Our onions will store until the next year's onion crop comes in. So we just finished cleaning the onions last night and moving them from the barn where they were drying up into the house and doing that initial selection work of the bulbs that we grew this year that we think are potential for producing the seed for next year. And then in the spring, when they've stored all winter, we'll go through them again, and any that have come out of dormancy, automatically do not get planted back to produce the seed next year. So Dakota Tears onion. Uncle David's Dakota dessert squash. Now this one I can say we do have a role to play in the selection work. Along with genetic diversity, you also have the potential for genetic drift, meaning that a variety will start throwing off types and less than desirable ones. And if you don't weed those out and maintain the trueness of type for that variety and maintain the optimal characteristics that you're looking for, you will eventually, deteriorate in quality until you basically have garbage. And I would argue that many of the carrots that we currently grow have not had this type of selection work. We have a really hard time finding carrot seed that we actually think the carrots, we don't offer a carrot at this point because we haven't found a carrot that we think is high enough quality that we can start from. So now this last year we grew a carrot that was bred out in Washington by a farmer breeder working with the Organic Seed Alliance. It's called Nash's Best, and I it actually performs really well here in North Dakota. We were worried about how well it would translate from Washington State to North Dakota. It's doing well. One of the issues they have in Washington State is they have Queen Anne's lace, which is it will cross with carrots and produce an unusable root. So if you ever see like these weird, gnarly looking, woody almost carrots come out of your patch, that's because there's Queen Anne's lace that's crossing in the seed production stage and creating an unusable root. So we did find some of that in Nash's Best carrot because, despite their best efforts, they have Queen Anne's lace growing in the hedgerows and road ditches and so forth. So we will eventually bring you a carrot, so we're thrilled about that. But Uncle David's Dakota dessert squash, we've been selecting this for sweetness, for a dark yellow flesh, and for a smooth texture for over 40 years. And I came into the farming operation in 84. And at that time, we actually, anytime we sat down to a meal, we had these little cards we had to fill out and rate them on those three characteristics: color, sweetness, and texture. And then those slips would go into each one of the pie tins with all the seed that was out of that particular squash. And at the end of this, and we had pie tins stacked, they had radiators, so we had pie tins stacked on the radiators with all these squash seeds drying. And then at the end of the season, we'd go through them all and look at our notes and decide which ones were the stock seed that would get planted back that season to produce the next crop. And by doing that over 40 years, we've dialed in the flavor for Uncle David's Dakota dessert squash. That was named by my kids, by the way. So Dakota black popcorn, this one you can see on the, would be your left, what we started with when we first bred this popcorn. You can see the sharp kernels, and we'd have occasionally run across cobs that had a nice smooth kernel. And you want a smooth kernel with popcorn because the sharp point is the weak point. So when you're popping popcorn, it's the moisture in the popcorn that causes the kernel to pop, but that if there's a sharp point, it'll pop prematurely. So you'll get a half-popped kernel because it didn't get hot enough before it exploded. So if you have a nice brown kernel, it'll heat to a higher temperature and you'll get a much better pop. So we've been selecting this against the sharp kernels, although we have a friend of ours who's selecting 4 sharp kernels in western North Dakota because it's less palatable to the deer. So I guess, your priorities, right? Now, we have this pretty dialed in here in North Dakota, but we have a friend of ours who grew it out in Washington State, and he's back to the primarily sharp kernels. Somehow the environmental conditions out in Washington, he's going to have to do his own selection work to dial that in again. So it's interesting. Crimson Sprinter tomato, I wanted to present this one because it has an interesting story in that we got this from a Seed Savers Exchange member she was an elderly woman. She thought she was the only person who had it. It was no longer commercially available. And she was looking for somebody to adopt it. So David took that seed in hand and began growing it, very prone to blossom end rot, very susceptible to the diseases we had up here in North Dakota. So he began doing selection work on it. And one of the things we did was actually create what we call a disease nursery, where we planted tomatoes over and over and over in the same spot. You don't do this, right? But we did it on purpose so that we could create a very diseased environment and then plant those tomatoes in that very diseased environment. The disease is present. And then do the selection work in there. So we were really stressing out this tomato. And what happened is that, well, here's a picture of our disease nursery, and actually this tomato up in the corner there that looks very diseased is a tomato that we were trialing out of the Oscar Will catalog. I'll get to Oscar Will here a little later, called Millets Dakota. It was a gardener who had, his last name was Millet, who had bred this tomato and introduced it to Oscar Will. So we took it out of the USDA germplasm collection, and we didn't have any other space in the field, so we gave it the acid test by putting it in our disease nursery, and you can see it did not do well. We also had some tomatoes that we planted that year. One of them was the fox cherry, and we planted that in the disease nursery as well. And that's the other really bright green tomato plant. This is there's some tomatoes under there, but they're not ripening yet. But that tomato plant had absolute resistance to all the diseases that were present in that patch. So that's the value of diversity and the value of planting stuff back within the environment of intended use. Millets Dakota tomato, it fell out of use in the I would guess 30s or 40s, and we pulled it out of the germplasm collection, and it had no ability to deal with the diseases that were present. Well, I shouldn't say no, it did produce fruit. So if you save that fruit and save that seed that it did produce and keep planting it back in that environment, eventually it will reach deep and try to find the resistance. But back to the Crimson Sprinter tomato, we were planting that in the disease nursery, stressing it out. And again, the gift of genetic diversity. Tomatoes are very genetically diverse. There's some that are more wild than others, meaning they're even more unpredictable, but Crimson Sprinter threw out what they call a sport. Anytime tomatoes are stressed, they'll send out one bract that is completely different from the parent. So it's like it mutates on its own, but within the same plant, but it'll be one branch. It's sort of like having a grafted apple tree. You've seen those grafted apple trees where they graft different varieties on different branches. Well, this had a branch that was completely different. And it was this very shiny, bright, glossy tomato. You couldn't miss it. The difference, it was much more intensely red than Crimson Sprinter, and the skin is ultra glossy. It looks like waxed fruit like your grandma might have had on their coffee table. And if it has that feel to it. The skin's very tender, so you have to handle it with care, but it's not the last thing in your mouth like so many other tomatoes. So we call this a pure gift. We didn't set out to breed a tomato, but by stressing out that tomato, it gifted us back with Dakota Sport tomato. Dakota Sisters melon, we've been selecting that over the course of about 20 years on our farm. And we didn't know how good our melon was until we accepted a seed contract with another seed company to grow melons for them. And we tried 2 years to produce Minnesota midget melons. For one thing, we couldn't find a genetically true to type seed source. The melons were all over the place. They're supposed to be about softball-sized melons, and we had everything under the sun. All different size ranges, some that looked like they were probably true to type, but it was like you couldn't produce a seed lot that you could call Minnesota midget because it just was not true to type. So unfortunately, that's what's happening to a lot of our varieties, is that if they're allowed to cross and you don't provide the isolation distances that you need, you'll get inferior melons. Well, just tasting those melons, we knew that, okay, we ought to release Dakota Sisters because it just tastes so much better from what's out there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Oscar H. Will and Company because they're a real inspiration to us, and I think also a very valuable source of historical information. Um, he began in, he started this company in 1894. It ran until 1960, 61, and then it was called Will's Catalog, I believe, and ran for a few more years before completely discontinuing. But he had a trial garden, a nursery, on the south end of Bismarck, when what's now the Kirkwood Mall, unfortunately. So he had a trial nursery, and he would trial varieties from all around the world and find the varieties that performed well here in North Dakota. And he had a catalog that he sent out, and we used to have one catalog that I think it was from the 1950s, that somehow got saved at our farm, and we donated it to the North Dakota Historical Society years ago, and now almost wish we hadn't, because it's such a valuable source of research and information where you can look to see what varieties were popular. And if they were popular, that means they probably performed well for gardeners. And so to look at back through the history of the catalog, what varieties and how long they were carried, and how Oscar Will described them, what was the variety descriptions that he used, what were the characteristics of those varieties and that were attractive that he was expounding in the catalog. So if any of you know of anybody, I missed my chance. There was a retiring agronomist or horticulturalist from NDSU that had a whole collection. He was going to donate them to us and decided to donate them to the Peace Gardens instead. So his collection is up there. We don't need a whole collection of Oscar Will catalogs, but it would just really help us to do our research, to have access to those catalogs. So you'll give me a copy. So historical information on what was successful. Jay talked a little bit about the starchy crops that the Hidatsa Indians had available. We had a group of school kids that came out to our farm a couple weeks ago, and I was showing them Hidatsa shield bean and telling them, well, this would have been one of the beans that the Hidatsa Indians shared with the Lewis and Clark expedition when they fed them, the winter that they were here. And they were just wowed by that. So the fact that you can have seed that has a history like that, and you can wow school kids with that kind of history, and they're a beautiful big plump bean, so you can see the bean pictured there. And then the other variety that we were able to get from the Oscar Will catalog was homesteader peas. This was one that he had originally gotten from England and brought here, and he touted it as being particularly drought resistant. We thought that was really interesting, a drought resistant pea. And so we trialed it on our farm, and we've traditionally grown Green Arrow and had been saving Green Arrow seed for years, and this one was better, and we were quite surprised by that. And we've been growing homesteader peas ever since, almost 10 years now, and decided to offer it and bring it back. It again is no longer commercially available except through us now. So going through those Oscar Will catalogs and finding out what varieties and what were the characteristics that he found interesting. So again, it is the social, economic, and political access to seed diversity at critical moments that can make or break a community's means of achieving food security. So I'll leave you with that quote from Gary Nahban, and just reiterate the value of biodiversity in agriculture.